So today I made a mistake of browsing various subreddits, including Islam and Catholicism, just sort of looking at what these religious groups sort of talk about online, and safe to say I was pretty shocked at what I found. Now, just out of curiosity, I posted on the Catholicism subreddit what do they think of religious figures who had organised events like the First Crusade or the Inquisition, just to see what they thought of these people. I thought, you know, given what we know now about the world and religion and everything, maybe these Catholics would think, you know, these people wouldn't be in heaven. People who organised the First Crusade, they might not be in heaven, even if they're a pope or not. So I was really shocked that most people who replied to me were all defending the Crusades as good things and saying that I was wrong to cast judgment on people like this, and even Hitler might be in heaven. And when I asked if genocide was as bad as sex before marriage, they told me both will send me straight to hell. And, you know, that sort of solidified my view of what sort of people go online to talk about their religion with other people in the same faith. But going back to the Crusade part, I just kind of want to debunk this whole stupid myth that the Crusade was a righteous war or a good war or even a defensive war, because this is a narrative that has come into the mainstream thanks to people like George Bush called the War on Terror a crusade. The sort of myth of the Crusade has come back into the mainstream, mainly what white nationalists use to justify a war against Islam. Now, what they normally say is that the Crusades were a response to Muslim invasions of Europe which needed to be repelled. You know, it was right to get rid of this religion that would degrade their women, all this sort of shit, you know, a totally righteous view of it, a really fucked up view of it in my opinion. So having studied the Crusades a lot in university, I sort of wanted to give my take on what the Crusades actually were and sort of cast aside all the myths that this was a good war, because I don't like putting today's morality in history, but I don't like glorifying stuff which was objectively horrible. You know, mass killing of civilians is horrible and not something that should be glorified in politics today, and that's what white nationalists are using. I also find it funny that Catholics on these Reddit are not really saying how bad this was. They're defending it. Like, I know it's something your institution you believe in, the Vatican, ordered, but can't you just acknowledge now that this was something that was really fucked up? I don't understand why anyone is defending this. So I want to read two comments I've got on Reddit which really inspired me to make this video. So one from one guy called The Federalist number 39. He told me, "That's not why the Crusades began." I told him why they began, I'll go into that a bit later. "The lands in question, mostly Jerusalem, were Christian, and the First Crusade was to take back those lands from the invading Islamic people. That statement is also true generally for all the Crusades. It was 600 years of back and forth between Christians and Muslims, with neither side being particularly forgiving or merciful." And just to also say, the Crusades did not last for 600 years. They didn't last from 1095 to 1695. That is completely warped view. It lasted to about the 1400s at latest, even though arguably a lot of the later crusades shouldn't even be called crusades. Another comment I got said, "I think you need to do research on the history of the Crusades. It was a response to nearly 400 years of passively observing the rape of their women," talking about Christians, "the murder of their children and the pillaging of their holy cities. Early Islam was spread by the sword. They had conquered a great part of the Iberian Peninsula, devastated a large portion of Italy, and were willing to threaten France. Where is the injustice here? The Crusades were the only appropriate way Europe could save herself from barbarism, her women from degradation, and her children from slavery." Now, before I read the last comment, I just want to touch on some things in this comment specifically, which is totally, really, as someone who has a history degree, is just really stupid. So he's painting Western Europe in 1095 as a unified entity which is under attack from a unified entity in Islam. So it's like today's European Union versus, I don't know, Turkey or something. Like, it's two factions going head to head, but that is completely wrong. Islam is not unified in this period at all. You have Arabs in Spain, you have Arabs in the Middle East, you have the Fatimid Empire in Egypt, which is Shia, you have Persians who are Shia Muslims, and that's a totally different empire. Then you have the Seljuk Turks, who are people who would come down from Asia and converted to Christianity, and these were the ones threatening Eastern Christianity in the form of the Byzantine Empire. So this is totally wrong. And Western Europe, in this period, France, as we know it today, wasn't even established. You can't even say France. It was loads of different regions split up into one. There was a Kingdom of France just around Paris, but that's about it. That was a tiny territory, and all these factions and all these different kingdoms were fighting each other. There was no unity. They weren't scared of these Muslims coming to take away France. There was no French king thinking, what's going to happen when they come over the Pyrenees to my borders? Because France didn't exist back then. So this is another stupid myth that white nationalists normally use. And for one more, for a really stupid person who's really depressing, Pirate King 94 says, "From a Catholic perspective, there's nothing that's really wrong with a crusade or the Inquisition," because I also said the Inquisition was bad, which it is. they can be misused to create great evil, but they also create good for Christendom as well. Don't buy into the black legend, actually study some unbiased history and you'll discover that the medieval church was a lot more just than you think, and that has 8 fucking upvotes. You know, that is fucking crazy. So just to touch on one thing, the black legend is basically Protestant propaganda in the 1500s against Catholics, which I don't know how that, you know, is really relevant to me today. I'm not reading any, you know, heavily Protestant history books or anything. I did a history degree which I studied all this religious stuff, and that's where I got my information from. You have to read tons of books, and even if one was influenced by the black legend, which I don't even think exists today, then I obviously wasn't completely influenced by it because I've read many different sources. So what I've shown you is an example of Catholic apologists, and basically I think some of them might be white nationalists, using the Crusades sort of this glorious thing and just, you know, really thinking it's acceptable to use it today. You know, mass killing. There's, like I said before, I don't like to use morality, today's morality, but I wouldn't glorify something like that. You just recognise it happened, recognise that's the time period it happened in, and leave it alone. You don't bring it into 2018 and be like, Crusades were good. So I want to touch on what the actual crusade was about and dispelling a lot of myths about it. So let's go into the First Crusade. So basically, I mentioned before the Seljuk Turks were Turks who'd come down from Asia, converted to Islam and taken over large portions of the Middle East. They were threatening the Byzantine Empire, which was the successor state to the Roman Empire. And the emperor of this, Emperor Alexis I, sent messengers to Pope Urban II, the Pope at the time, saying, can you send some European knights to the Byzantine Empire and help us defend against the Seljuk Turks, because we're afraid they might conquer Constantinople, which we know today is Istanbul. And then on the way back from Paris, where Pope Urban got these messages, he sort of invented this crusade in his head, and then he preached this to lots of people saying, you know, we need to take back the Holy Land, you know, this is our chance. And then lots of people took the crosses when you like get this sort of like tattoo mark. It was a cross to say you were going to go on the crusade. And what he promised the crusaders was, if you go and die in this crusade, all your sins will be forgiven, you'll be put into purgatory if you're a sinner, because a lot of these knights had killed a lot of people, so they're not going straight to heaven, but you know, you're not going to hell, you're going to get into heaven one day. So like I've just said, the reason for the First Crusade being formed was because the emperor of the Byzantine Empire asked for help. But what the narrative a lot of white nationalists say, and a lot of Catholics apparently, according to that subreddit, is that the whole of Western Europe was under threat from Islam. But what actually happened is, after Muhammad's death, the Islamic Empire, or the I think it's the Umayyad Caliphate is the first one, it spreads across North Africa and the Middle East, and eventually a faction of that go across into Spain in 711 and conquer most of Spain. That's in 711 to 720. That is not in 1095. So that is one part. And by the time in 1095, their empire in Spain was not doing so well. It wasn't a threat to Western, you know, it wasn't a threat to Western Europe, which doesn't really exist in this period. It was just, you know, sort of a, not a backwards, but not really powerful enough to challenge a lot of the kingdoms in places like France. And a lot of people also get confused about the Ottoman Empire, which later conquered a lot of the Balkans and nearly conquered Vienna in the 1520s. That's another area they use. They say Islam's trying to conquer all of Europe, but what we have here is 700 years of history where one event happens on one side, the conquest of Spain, and one happens on the other side in the 1500s, the conquest of the Balkans and the conquest of, well, nearly the conquest of Central Europe. And you also have some other areas, like there's warring factions in Italy and Sicily where Franks and Turks and Arabs all fight for control. These people don't understand history because this isn't the European Union they're fighting. These are just various kingdoms and various different territories on the earth. Europe, as we understand it today, is a modern concept. Back in the 1000s, there was no unified European like nationalism. There wasn't anything like we're the West and that's the East. It was just, these are different kingdoms. We might be unified with Christianity, but we're very, very different, and we're going to fight wars against each other. We're not unified to help each other. So a lot of different kings and knights from different areas of Europe went over to fight the Crusade. Places from Germany, William the Conqueror's brother went, this prince from Sicily called Bohemond, who was leader of the Franks, and they all went over to fight the Crusade. And most of you know they fought through the Levant. They overcame overwhelming odds, and eventually they came to Jerusalem. And I want to read you some contemporary accounts of what they did when they got to Jerusalem, and then you tell me, if you were a Christian or white nationalist, would you really want to glorify this? So I mentioned someone called Bohemond before, and he had one of his knights scribe most of the crusade, and it's one of the best sources for the First Crusade today. So according to the Gesta Francorum, speaking only about the Temple of the Mount Air in Jerusalem, Our men were killing and slaying even to the Temple of Solomon, where the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. According to another crusader, Raymond of Aguilar's, also writing in about the Temple of the Mount area, he said, "In the temple on the porch of Solomon, men rode in blood up to their knees and bridle reins." Writing about the same area, this priest called Fulcher of Chartres, also he was an eyewitness in Jerusalem, he said that in the temple 10,000 were killed. Indeed, if you'd been there, you would have seen our feet coloured to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive. Neither women nor children were spared. And then one more little bit from the Gesta Francorum. When the pagans had been overcome, our men seized great numbers, both men and women, and either killed them or kept them as captives, or did whatever they wished to them. So that is obviously a really brutal conquest of Jerusalem, and it's not unique to the era. You know, that happened in most cities when another faction conquered them. They would kill most people, enslave them, rape the women. That was all standard in the day. And I'm not trying to say, you know, I'm not judging the morality of that day, even though it's fucked up and it would have been horrific even back then. I'm not saying, you know, I'm coming in my 2018 morals and saying that's bad. What I'm saying is taking that event and putting it on a pedestal, saying this crusade was good. That was a good event when we slaughtered nearly everyone in Jerusalem, women and children, and we enslaved them. This was good, and everyone should remember it as good, and we should not apologise or not say this is bad or let's never have something like this happen again. It's, yeah, the crusade was great and we were defending ourselves against Islam. And as I've already painted, there is no defence against Islam. A view of that has no nuance. Like I've said, there's so many different factions, and even during the crusade, many of the Muslims ally with the Crusaders. So the Fatimids, I said before, they offered the Crusaders help in conquering Jerusalem. During, you know, the whole path to Jerusalem, Arab warlords, different ones who were fighting each other, they would come to the Crusaders and ask them if they wanted to ally with them and help them fight other Arab warlords. There was no unified Islamic faction, and there was no unified, you know, Western European faction in Europe. It manifested itself in the form of the Crusade, lots of Western forces coming together, but that doesn't mean they all felt like they were under threat. They went over to reclaim the Holy Land. They didn't go over there to defend themselves from Islam. And if anyone you know tries to defend the First Crusade, I'm not saying you, in terms of, you know, what the Pope wanted in that time, or, you know, what these knights wanted, you know, that's just history, that happened. But I'm saying you should not hold it up as something great that happened. If someone tries to paint it as a great event, then just tell them what happened. Tell them what happened in Jerusalem. Tell them, you know, the nature of the factions at the time, the nature of countries. You know, France didn't exist at this time, Germany didn't exist at this time, the UK didn't exist in this time. There was smaller forms, so there was England to some extent, there was France to a tiny extent, there was no Germany, there was no Italy, there was no Western Europe fighting Islam, and there was no Islamic, you know, caliphate. It wasn't the Ottoman Empire or anything like that. It was loads of different factions who weren't unified and didn't all have a goal of conquering the West. They didn't, you know, a lot of them didn't even know what the West looked like, so they hadn't been there, or wouldn't even have maps of it. So you have to have nuance in these arguments, and if you're not a fucking idiot, you know today using the Crusade as a positive analogy for anything is just wrong. It's just fucked up. So you can't hold up this holy war as something that was good in our history. It happened. It was fucked up. It was unnecessary, but it's just history, and it happened, but it wasn't a defensive war, as white nationalists like to play the victim to Islam all the time. You have two events that are unrelated. You have the conquest of Spain and the conquest of the Balkans and Central Europe, you know, 700, 800 years apart. It's not related. And like I said, there's no monolithic entity of Islam trying to conquer the monolithic entity of Western Europe. It just didn't fucking happen. So let me know what you guys think. If you want to research the First Crusade, I really recommend it. It's a really interesting period. And like I said, don't put today's morals in it, but just don't read all that stuff, like especially that massacre in Jerusalem, and talk about how great the Crusade was and how it was a defensive war, because it just wasn't a defensive war. Islam was not coming to invade the whole Western Europe. There was no unified Islam at this time.